Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 108 of Humanity Rising. Virtually every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations have created essentially a global commons each day beginning at 5 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, so that people from around the world can come together and share their experiences of how they're navigating through this extraordinary human event, this pandemic, the coronavirus that has shut the world down effectively, reduced all of our economies, put most of us in some form of lockdown. Social distancing has emerged as a new social norm. We've all become acutely conscious of our health, and we all have anxieties about the human future. We ain't in Kansas anymore, as it said in Alice in Wonderland. We're in a new world, and none of us are quite sure what it portends to us personally, and to our families, and to our communities, to our countries, and to the human community. We do know that scientists are telling us from all over the world that we're running out of time to solve the issue that gave rise to the pandemic, and that is climate change. Climate change is spinning out of control. And over the next few years, we either solve the problem or the problem could well eliminate humanity as we know it. And therefore, the mission of Humanity Rising is to bring people together in such a way that not only do we share our experiences as we navigate through this extraordinary time, but we come together with sufficient strategic effectiveness that we actually make a difference in the post-pandemic world. The situation is not getting any better. It was announced just yesterday that India is projecting upwards of 60 million cases of COVID-19. Just take that in for a moment. 60 million cases in one country. Simultaneously, it was announced this morning that according to, I think it was the World Wildlife Fund, 40% of all the plants in the world are now threatened by extinction. And this comes on the heels of a report about a month ago by the World Wildlife Fund that said between 1970 and 2016, 68% of all the animals, birds, and fish have gone extinct, all due to human encroachment. We found out about 12 hours ago that President Trump and the First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, have tested positive for COVID, along with senior aide, Hope Hicks. There's the prospect that most of the White House staff will be under voluntary quarantine. It's worth noting that since the pandemic began, there have been 3 leaders in the world that have been the most derisive about the pandemic, about wearing masks, about engaging in even the most minimal scientifically informed procedures. That was Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Donald Trump in the United States. And all 3 of them got the COVID-19 virus. So as we move forward now into October, we need to understand that this pandemic that started in February, then in March, began to intensify. is proving itself to be extraordinarily intractable and has now felled the most powerful man on earth. And how this will play out in terms of the US election, how this plays out now in terms of global response is unknown. But let us all use this as an occasion to rededicate ourselves to doing what is necessary to ensure public safety and human well-being. Today, we move into areas that we have touched on before, but now we want to bring in two women leaders in different parts of the world. Cindy Ford, founder of Planetary, an educational institution for preschool and primary school students on the ecology. Christie Mcdougall from Australia, and with Syntropic Enterprises, which she's the founder, that's looking most recently at how business can conform itself with natural systems. So the meta theme today is the theme of education, and more broadly, probably new mindsets, how we bring new mindsets into business and how we bring new mindsets into education. So Cindy and Christine, I thank you for joining us. And I turn the podium now over to you, Cindy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim, for that fantastic introduction. And thank you to everybody for joining us on this exploration of how to redesign our systems for a world with a future. As Jim said, I'm Cindy. It's my great pleasure to be presenting with the formidable Christie Mcdougall, who will begin this session. Christine's a long-time student of the work and proponent of the work of Buckminster Fuller. As many of you will know, Buckminster Fuller wrote the operating manual for spaceship Earth back in 1969. And 50 years on, we have never been more in need of such a guide, which is what makes Christine's work on Syntropic Enterprises so compelling. Based on Fuller's models, she explores how we can move from this mode of extract to extinction to one of regeneration by designing our systems and organizations in line with the principles that support all life on Earth. So I'm deeply grateful for Christine for that, and also because she's dialing in this morning from the Gold Coast in Australia, where it is actually 1 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, huge thanks, Christine. It's a fantastic thing to do. So after Christine's presented, I'm going to give an overview of Planetary, which, as Jim said, is an education system that I've had the great privilege to be co-developing with an extraordinary group of people. Planetary enables children to understand Earth as an interconnected system and to think systemically or syntropically, and that equips them to be the innovators and the entrepreneurs of a better world. But most importantly, we'd like to make sure there's time for your questions and to share your thoughts and ideas so that we can learn from each other. So therefore, we'll be keeping about half of this session for questions and answers and discussions with you all. So thanks very much for that. And before Christine invites you into the wonderful world of Syntropic, I'd like to open this session and to welcome you with a reading from the illuminating Celtic poet, John O'Donoghue. And this is a reading on thresholds, as the Humanity Rising Summit brings us together in awareness that we stand at a threshold which, if we have the courage to cross, opens the potential of reshaping our world. Like spring, secretly at work within the heart of winter, below the surface of our lives, huge changes are in fermentation. We never suspect a thing. Then when the grip of some long enduring winter mentality begins to loosen, we find ourselves vulnerable to a flourish of possibility and we are suddenly negotiating the challenge of a threshold. At any time, you can ask yourself, at which threshold am I now standing? At this time of my life, what am I leaving? Where am I about to enter? What is preventing me from crossing my next threshold? What gift would enable me to do it? A threshold is not a simple boundary. It is a frontier that divides two different territories, rhythms, and atmospheres. Indeed, it is a lovely testimony to the fullness and integrity of an experience or a stage of life that intensifies towards the end into a real frontier that cannot be crossed without the heart being passionately engaged and woken up. At this threshold, a great complexity of emotions comes alive: confusion, fear, excitement, sadness, hope. So thanks so much again for joining us, and I'll now hand over to Christine.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you to the amazing John O'Donoghue. It's very hard to back those words with anything of substance. It is a delight to be here, and so I'm just going to give you a sort of a brief taste of what Syntropic Enterprise is all about. And to do that, I really need to start with what it is and why this has become my life's work. So as Cindy mentioned, I was deeply affected by Bucky Fuller from my mid-20s. And I had the privilege of spending time, not with him, unfortunately, but with a group of people, including Amy Edmondson, who was his protege for the last 3 years of his life, studying his work intensely. And that meant also that we built models, because Bucky wasn't a theoretical person, he was a model builder. And the point of his life was to understand why humans were in universe and what we were here to do. And he also wanted to understand the laws of universe that he called generalized principles, true in all cases. And what he did in his life was he applied those laws to the built environment. So he created incredible models from a very, from 1927 that demonstrated these laws. He was the creator of the geodesic dome, which still to this day is the most economical way to hold space or cover, include space without a single strut. And the bigger the geodesic dome, the more stable it is. So you could literally put a geodesic dome over the whole of Manhattan and change the environment if you needed to. But anyway, so my work has always been about how do we apply those generalized principles, true in all cases, to how we do enterprise design and human engagement and human coordination. Because Bucky also taught me that most of our human constructed models, the way we do economy, our monetary systems, our governance systems, our legal enterprise systems, the structures of our legal enterprises are human constructed and completely and absolutely ignore the laws of universe, the laws of nature, essentially, in their design. And so this impulse of humans to impose upon things that are antithetical or entropic to nature's systems is something that I've explored most of my life. And so how this sort of manifested for me was through the art of convening. And I've always been someone who has loved to convene people together. And around a central purpose that people really cared about, because the founding sort of belief is that the world is filled mostly with good people and good people who really want to come together around a purpose that they care about and do so in a way that changes how we live and be as humanity. And I also believe that most of us have aspiration for a more beautiful world and a world with a future. But how do we do that? And that is the question. And so over a lifetime of exploring how to bring people together, I had 30 years of experimentation of it falling into a messy human heap. And I'm sure if any of you have any experience of coming together with groups, even family groups, the messy human heap is something that you're familiar with. So in 2015, I was inspired to create an event in my local community called Big Blue Sky. And the purpose was to bring multi-stakeholders of our community together to co-create the future of our city. And what I did, it was a very inspired project. And what I did was I created this architecture of the convening of the enterprise, which we call the Trust Manifesto. And we actually put it into the legal trust of Big Blue Sky. And so it was a requisite for anybody who was part of the active participation of Big Blue Sky to read the trust and complete the exercise, to cross a threshold, to refer to the beautiful poem of John O'Donoghue, with sovereign choice, but agreeing that if we were going to be creating this event, that this was the way that we were going to work together and hold each other together. And that enabled a group of 12 complete strangers from highly diverse backgrounds over the period of 6 months to co-create a world-class event without a single human upset and entirely self-managed. And if you had been there as a participant in that event, you would have walked into the room and sensed that there was something magical happening here, because it's the invisible spaces, it's the weightless and immeasurable spaces, and how that's held together that creates these extraordinary experiences for humans. And of course, Bucky called love metaphysical gravity. And so in the world that we have right now, you know, of course, part of what we do in enterprise design is we have systems of how we account for things. And almost entirely our accounting mechanisms reduce everything to one single metric, which is the metric of money. And so part of what we do in Syntropic World is we account for value in a minimum of 6 domains of input. And some of those inputs are things like love and care and compassion, warm data type of inputs. And so we value those as human contribution. In post the event of 2015, Big Blue Sky, I went into a very dark existential crisis from a number of reasons. And on emerging from that, I made a decision that the rest of my life I was going to focus, rather than trying to change the deck chairs on a Titanic, I was going to focus on the world that we can create. And so and because I love enterprise, which literally means endeavor, human engagement. So enterprise is anything from a community group to 2 people working together, to a large multinational, to a not-for-profit, anything where people come together is an enterprise. But I knew that we had to call this type of enterprise for a world with a future something different, because social enterprise has been co-opted and doesn't fully explain the type of enterprise that we're aiming to support and see as the enterprise of the future. And so I went back to Bucky's books, and of course he had talked for years about the entropic nature of universe, but he had always argued that entropy, which is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that we are in a disintegrating universe. He had always argued that that was actually, there was this opposite force, because one of the generalized principles is unity is plural of minimum 2. And so to entropy, we have syntropy. And syntropy literally means towards a higher order for an eternally regenerative universe. And so in short, in code, syntropy means leaving everything better. everything. And it is a complete re-examination of how we do enterprise, create enterprise. And the term syntropic enterprise, we placed in the Creative Commons because I didn't want to own it and I didn't want anyone else to own it. I wanted it to be a commons, as Jim mentioned earlier. It's important that we reanimate the commons. And so the space that we're holding in Syntropic World is that Syntropic enterprise becomes the way we do business, not the far exception. But within that, there's a re-examination of every single assumption and every system that we have. And it is really intrinsically motivated by one of Bucky's quotes, which is, don't try and change the existing system. Build new models that make the existing obsolete. And so it is towards that we've turned our attention. And rather than fumbling around with what's not working, it's how do we actually create and design what will work. And of course, along that, acknowledging that we will be making mistakes, but if we are really paying attention to laws of nature, the laws of the universe that have been in existence well before humans, if we really pay attention to that, and always be sure that we're in partnership with laws of universe versus trying to dominate, then our course correction should be much easier. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of a sort of background, and then some of the key components that we work on within Syntropic Enterprise are things such as what we call synergistic accounting, which is based on Bucky's 12 degrees of freedom, but essentially looking at how we honor and respect value in 6 domains of input and 6 domains of output. And the 6 is built around geometry, which was essentially geometry is the study of relationships, but a core part of Bucky's work. And so when people, and Cindy referred to the threshold crossing, one of the other key elements that we have within the work that we teach around how to create a syntropic enterprise is the architecture that says, if you're part of this enterprise, then this is what we agree to. And so in our sort of like model, we're using a simple biological structure, which is the cell membrane. And the reason that we do this is because the cell membrane is an exquisite microcosm of a macrocosm. And what it does is it has an intelligence within the membrane. Of course, we're looking at a sphere versus a flat. But what it has is it has the intelligence that prevents elements from leaving. But it simultaneously has elements that prevent things from coming in. But its ideal purpose is to have this beautiful free flow of information and so on coming in and out of the cell. And then this threshold crossing, the membrane, is where we also position one of the principles that we use, which is the steward leader. So rather than looking at the leader as a hierarchical leader, which is our old models, you know, that the leader is the CEO, sits up here. In Syntropic Enterprise, leadership is held as a space holder. And the intelligence of the cell, anyone who knows cell biology, is that the membrane has some primary purpose, which includes attending to the ecology within the cell, so within the enterprise, while simultaneously being aware of the ecology outside of the cell. And that's not just in the immediate outside of the cell, but that is also in the, if the cell is the cell in the liver of Christine, It is also aware that that liver of Christine is standing right now in the Southern Hemisphere, speaking predominantly to people in the Northern Hemisphere. And so, and my liver is adapting to the environment of which I'm in, entering summer and actually quite warm in the Southern Hemisphere. And then even a larger field, which is the universe, you know, the globe and the universe. So the steward's leader's role is an attenuating intelligence to all of these ecologies, which also defies the current model that we have of leadership, which is this busyness and endlessly squeezed for any opportunity to attenuate or tune to what is happening in the environments. But to circle back to this threshold crossing, what we created in the Trust Manifesto is a set of agreements of how we show up for each other, and how we manage, how the starting point of where we come from, how we manage when things go pear-shaped, which they will, and who makes decisions, and how that whole enterprise works. And it's not a one size fits all, because of course each enterprise has its unique pattern integrity, which is just like a child. Like every child has their own unique pattern integrity. An enterprise has its unique pattern integrity. And so to create an enterprise architecture that holds the shape of that pattern integrity is not a blanket throwing over every enterprise. It is a deep consideration of how we create that architecture. And part of the threshold crossing is that if you are somebody out here who is considering being a participant, an active, and that's the key word, an active participant within this enterprise, then it's not just a skip across the threshold. There's actually some requirement, not only an agreement to this is how we behave with each other, but there is a requirement to invest yourself in a process. And the tool that we use for that, which I referenced earlier, is the tool of Synergistic Accounting, where we get people to nominate and to record what they have the capacity, willingness, and desire to bring to this enterprise in the 6 domains that we cover. And for that bringing, what do they expect in return for bringing what they're giving to us? And we hold that is a mutable document. So it's not something that is fixed, because we want whole people to show up here, people who have lives and children and other passions and other commitments. So if we don't create architecture in which you, as the participant, the active participant within that enterprise, if you suddenly find yourself with a child in emergency, is there a space in the enterprise for you to actually attend with 100% commitment to your child in the emergency? And do we design that into how we create enterprise? And so, but equally, this threshold crossing is self-development, which is really important with any enterprise design, is that we all get to grow up as we engage with the evolutionary purpose for which we're coming together. And so in the process of doing the synergistic audit, people discover that they have one or both. They either have a difficult time naming the value that they have to bring, and they have a difficult time asking for what they expect in return and being truthful about that. And so part of the ongoing engagement for people who are working within a syntropic enterprise is that they discover that their value could actually be more than they think or less than they think. Their value could be different. They could discover elements that they had neglected to bring into this enterprise. And they also might find that they've undervalued themselves, and they need to actually speak into the value and the value exchange that they're hoping for. So it's a very dynamic conversation that is always alive within a syntropic enterprise. And of course, most of us, if in audiences I've spoken to, have had experiences where we've bought our value and we've been completely and absolutely unrecognized for that value. And so how do we create an enterprise where individuals' values is an intrinsic part of the architecture of that enterprise's ongoing purpose, and that we create the space where people can show up and can be both grow up and be seen for their value, but also have the values that they're not bringing be reflected back to them. And then how do we create the architecture for that to happen, where people can be then acknowledged in multiple ways, not just financially, but in multiple ways that really honors the contribution that somebody's making. So these are parts of these are just some of the elements of what we use in Syntropic Enterprise. And it's all of the models that we're teaching at the moment are very much practical and have been applied in enterprise with great success. So this is not an experiment. However, the larger experiment is how do we actually do this and do it and get as many enterprises in the world to become syntropic, because that's what we need. We need to demonstrate that when people like us do things like this is what happens. So rather than trying to change the financial system and the monetary system and the governance system and the legal system from the top end, what we're really doing at Syntropic Enterprise is building the models that says, when we do this, this is what happens to communities, this is what happens to people, this is what happens to the products and services that we create. We're deploying a whole systems thinking around it. And so I am under no illusion that what we're doing is a easy thing. And I am very, very aware that it's going to take probably past my lifetime for this to actually happen. But I also know that if we don't do this, if we don't really focus on the world that we want to create and spend our time and our joy and our heartfelt passion focused on that, the easiness to fall down the rabbit hole of anger and all of the things that are propagated, the polarization and so on that is just increasing in the world, is so easy to do that. But my challenge is to how we actually take this turn and look at the world that we do want to create and be willing to sit in the conversation of how to do that. And so part of what we've done at Syntropic World is we're creating a global community of practice on how to do that, where we share best practices, stories, etc., applying these principles, learning from each other, building the models, demonstrating the enterprises, and then just getting this moving. We've got lawyers now working with how we can consider creating different legal entities, because the limited liability corporation actually, even if you are a B Corp, limited liability corporation, it still has within it the architecture that is animating the current model that we have. And so that's the work of Syntropic. It is truly one of the most amazing bodies of work. I'm so delighted to be a part of it, and part of it with incredible people like Cindy, who is her business planetary is, a representation of the Syntropic enterprise. And so this is the work that we're doing, and it'll take me the rest of my life. Cindy?
Well, thanks so much, Christine. It's always absolutely fascinating to see you explain that. And I you know, as I can see in the chat, a lot of you are picking up that it's a huge undertaking, and I hope that it's very hard to get it in the time that we've got, but Christine does run a series of masterclasses in all time zones, Australia, US, Europe, that run over a period of weeks, actually, because that's how long it really does take to work through this. So, you know, thanks so much for the opening your minds to get this, you know, this small taster of what Christine is bringing into the world. And yeah, I'm so inspired by it that as soon as I met Christine and found out that we can, you know, I think we're all in this community looking at different ways and different models, but this was the closest thing really to a roadmap for how to do that. So I, you know, really inspired me in how I'm bringing my own organized stewarding. I don't think of myself as a CEO. I think the steward leader is a really important way of thinking of yourself, because these ideas that we hope will help us build a world with a future land with somebody, you know, that's an impulse. It's you know, it's an intention, a purpose, but it has to be shared to work. So, you know, I believe I'm stewarding this idea of planetary into the world, and the people are showing up, and we're building a collaboration, all the different values and the skills that we have to get it out there. So, you know, it's very much syntropic in its intention. So I'll just take you through. I'm afraid I'm not as brilliant as Christine to be able to stand there with no props except a flip chart. That's part of my evolution. I'm going to share a little deck with you more, so it's visually interesting, and also to show you some of the materials that we're creating in Planetary. So if you could just bear with me a sec while I share this screen. I need to hold on a sec. Let's share and slideshow, please start. Yeah, so the big question that we're asking at Planetary, again, it is systems change or threshold crossing. How do we now scale education fit for the future and in time to make a difference? I was reading some of the comments in the chat. We know that we haven't got, you know, we've got this last decade to really try to address the worst ravages of climate change. And if we're bringing up another generation who can't get that, then we're in deep trouble. So we are trying to move fast and answer this question. I think everybody in the Humanity Rising community will be more than aware of the problems here. We're affecting the controls of the biosphere, but there's no integrated education system that's encouraging, that's enabling children to think differently. So we're just repeating the same old model. So we have to argue with the model, as Christine has said, and we have to design education syntropically. The good news is we've got this 193 countries that have signed up to the global goals to do something about this by 2030, this commitment to leave no one behind. But what is actually happening in our education systems? We see these, I don't know if you can see my screen because it's got myself. You can see these things, all our life support systems are pushed to their limits, but it's not stupid people or uneducated people, I should say, that have brought this to pass. Sorry, I find this quite shocking. Only around 3% of people in the world go to university, but they take up 80% of the leadership positions. These decisions are made by people with PhDs, by MBAs, by, you know, with all the qualifications that the accolades, the highest qualifications that our education system produces. And this has brought us to this tipping point. So something clearly has to shift. I've put this on there. So what are we so frightened about in this threshold crossing? You know, we have this image of ourselves living in a civilized world. There's a superb native First Nations professor called Jack D. Forbes, and he wrote a book called Columbus and Other Cannibals. This is his definition. I just want to read a very little extract from this book. Over and over again, we see European writers ranking civilizations, societies which have large slave populations, rigid social class systems, unethical or ruthless leaders, and aggressive imperialistic foreign policies. Conversely, societies with no slaves, no distinct social classes, no rules, and no imperialism are either regarded as insignificant, not worth mentioning, or primitive and uncivilized. This weird method of evaluating cultures reaches the ridiculous when we discover European historians of the southwestern United States continuously exalting the Spaniards as representing civilization, while the democratic, non-aggressive native people are barbarians. The civilized Spaniards burn, loot, rape, exploit, deceive, and massacre, but it's always the native defenders who are cast in the role of savage and villains. Hence the picture there of John Wayne, slightly ironically, but also really to see there's a whole myth making. It's not just education, it's television, it's Hollywood, it's media that perpetuates this worldview that we have of a civilization that we are unable to see beyond. So there's superb other lenses to look through. I think Jack D. Forbes encapsulates that, the bewilderment of trying to see this as civilized from a First Nations perspective. And it is just a matter of how we're taught to see the world. So there's so much that can be done that versus this absurdity. So the currency does teach our children to not to question and not conform, and that exacerbates the problem. It's really shocking that at this juncture, with climate change in a rapid state of escalation, that you can go through the entire education system and barely hear it mentioned in your lessons more than 10 times. Now, that obviously extends right across the disciplines. We're seeing what is being brought hugely into question with the advent of the murder of George Floyd is what on earth are we teaching in history? This was a quote that came out the day before yesterday by one of the teaching bodies in the UK, and yet you have absolutely superb bodies of work. I've put up James Baldwin here, I Am Not Your Negro. He examines the whole creation of this concept of a Negro. It's not, doesn't represent Black people at all. It's more what is a construct of the civilization to play off against, because you need somebody in this deeply degraded position in order to have the myth of superiority. But it's there's so much behind that. I won't dwell on it, but as I say, it's just a cross-disciplinary lack of education, of awareness, of consciousness. Possibly the worst, the most dangerous of all is the economics. We're taught that the resources on this planet, the model is constant growth, and yet the resources on this planet are finite. This is the superb Kate Raworth, who you're all probably familiar with her work now on donut economics, but she's saying that they're still handing out textbooks on day one of nearly all economics classes, which they do not teach that the earth is finite. And this is her quote about just how astonishing that is. Even the economist who created these theories would be astounded that they're still being used. They were designed for a century when we weren't facing the kinds of issues that we are now. So there's a massive need for an evolution systemically. Teachers know this, children know this. So it's just time to argue with the model and build a syntropic system of education right from the earliest years all the way through, so that children come out of school understanding how Earth works systemically and equipped to use that in whatever field, whether they be hairdressers or astrophysicists. They need to know how you work with planet Earth to create businesses that regenerate rather than cause harm. So it does require new maps, new models, and new thinking. So I'm absolutely delighted to be working with Christine and having this amazing platform to build on, which builds on the work of Buckminster Fuller, which Christine is now making available for other businesses who are bold enough really to cross that threshold. Planetary, what is it? Well, the first rule of revolution is to take over the radio station, which is very much what we're trying to do here. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the channels of communications that are out there. The technology is superb. The reach is enormous. It's more the messaging and the content that we need to shift. Excuse me. So we're designing a multimedia education platform children to solve these global challenges. We're using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as our content guide. That's where we want to be a global community, then we better start teaching towards that in our schools from the word go. Again, it's interdisciplinary. You're not going to solve problems. You're not going to understand the interconnections between so much of what we do and the impacts that we have are systemic. Unless children can start to understand our earth in that way, we won't be able to find the solution. So we're working across disciplines, and we're using multimedia as well, because there has to be so much more creativity and imagination brought into how children learn. The children in our generation now, they're surrounded by things which are utterly fabulous, high production values, 3D, virtual reality, and yet you go into school and the information is still delivered in this often singular and quite dry way, which particularly things around environment, ecology, because they're sort of the poor relations of other subjects, and children are very aware of that. So we're trying to make this absolutely delightful. They're being positioned as adventures, as expeditions, where you learn to become a really intrepid explorer with these fabulous skills. Sorry, I'm struggling a bit with this, with the tech on my machine. So we are, again, the principles behind this is we need human beings who can share, save lives, resources, and biodiversity by averting this systems crisis. So people, who can care, people who know how to collaborate, share, let's innovate, let's cross-fertilize, let's find these solutions together, and to dare to think differently, to drive these new models of wealth creation and well-being. The mission, I'm sure, is one that we hope will resonate with people here. We just, by 2030, we need children people who are dedicated to enabling all of us to live well on this planet and all life forms. Again, as I said, we're using the UN SDGs as the content guide, and then taking the goals, which can be things that are quite heavy and difficult to access to children, and turning them, as I say, into these missions, these expeditions. So climate action becomes mission cool, renewable energy becomes superpower, things that children will really feel inspiring and want to learn about and want to be part of. It's very important that they see this as the most exciting time to be alive, and to see it as this massive opportunity for human transformation, rather than one where they're worrying about being overwhelmed by problems, which I think happens to so many of us. So it's about the excitement, it's about what can be done, and it's about being part of that. This is just a quick tour through some of the things that we're producing. We've come up with this concept of makerzines. It's a kind of hybrid between things that give you information, but you can also get your hands on and learn in a really interactive way. So these things have bits that pop up or pieces that you can pull out, and actually, if you're talking about a marine protected area, then why not make one? If you're talking about reseeding an oyster bed, make the tech that actually makes that possible, because once children get a physical experience of that, they've got much more of a sense, yes, we can do this. We're building a global community of change makers. These little children you can see here in the blue, they're in the Maldives, and this is our ocean adventure, which is talking about life. It correlates to UN SDG 14, life below water, and their island is in that. There would be used coral reefs to actually, as an example of protecting what happens when you properly care for an ecosystem. And we were so lucky with this makerzine. We partnered with the superb Blue Marine Foundation, who actually have a project in the Maldives, and so they, we worked with their project and involved the children on the island in the project. So the children around the world, the little English kids who you saw in this slide here, are learning about what's happening with these children in the Maldives. And these children here in St. Helena Island, that is their island that's popping up there in the magazine, and that's been created again by Blue as this absolutely superb marine protected area. So they're thrilled because not only are they learning about what marine protection does, but it's their island that's featuring in this, in the learning resources, and the children know about each other, and they know that if we look after our reefs in the Maldives, then we have good air to breathe in Cambridge, which is where the other children are. And a lot of teachers are terrified, but they don't have the resources or the training to teach these subjects. They want to teach them, but they don't have access because it's not made available in teacher training. And you think, God, I'm not a scientist, I can't teach this up. A lot of it isn't science anyway. As I say, it's interdisciplinary, but we're trying to make it as easy as possible for teachers. So we're creating the lesson plans, the downloadable, the digital resources for them to use, and also trying to build communities of teachers because they're under huge pressures as well. They know full well things that need to change, but they're kind of trapped in a system, but we're working with them so that they can be part collaboratively of building the new models of moving towards, a syntropic type of education. That's just some of the things that you can see. Again, really vibrant, really fun, turn things into games, make it an adventure. And, using all the fabulous media that's out there in this world, and just at the same production values and qualities that you would find in your TV, except the content is something that hopefully will help to shape a different worldview, moving from the John Wayne to the Jack Forbes. And we're really lucky to have the participation of some superb people, very well-known people who really want to use their platforms and their celebrity to be part of making change. So this is some of the, you can see the children get a sense of themselves as activists. They're the ones that go out and do the interviewing, the reporting back. We designed fun little apps. So instead of being on your phones doing something that can be quite pernicious or mindless, you can use the those mediums for something that are really will teach you how to something valuable, how to take care of. And this is again the little island. The diver goes down and he discovers all these endemic species to the island, and how it's very simple things for how to take care of it. But I hope in principle that's kind of giving you an overview of there's the form of our enterprise, which is trying to build this very collaboratively. It's not owned by anybody. It belongs to the people who want to make this happen. You bring what you can, and everybody's got something, a piece of the puzzle together. We're exponentially stronger. So we're syntropic by design. And then in content, we're trying to foster this mindset of syntropy for the children that we're able to work with. And this is a little guide here, which is produced by the United Nations. What would education look like if we were to get towards these? So we're putting those things in practice. Children are overloaded with information. So what you actually need now is to learn how to synthesize that information, think systemically, think empathetically, think critically. And those are the things that we're building into how children learn. And yeah, thanks very much indeed for listening to that. That leaves us with about 25 minutes, I think, for discussion and questions and answers. If you've got questions to me or Christine about what you've seen, but we'd also really love to hear your thoughts as well. So thanks very much. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Christine. There was a couple of comments and questions as you were both talking that I can just bring into the conversation. One by a woman, Barbo Esberdotter, saying that in her education, I think she recalls only reading one book that was not by a man. I am not your Negro author. that in all his schooling, there wasn't any book that was really relevant. And I think all of us can look back on our education, Cindy, and realize that somehow the educational system became a conspiracy against reality. Mm-hmm. That most of the things that not only on race, gender, worldview, the educational system really locks the mind down to very limited conventions. And it's, I would love both of your comments on both how education as we know it had become so narrow and intolerant and one-dimensional, and what we can all do to open it up, because I think that is the central challenge of education today, is to open it up to the diversity of life as we know it, and open it up to the relevance of the larger ecosystem within which we need to align.
Christine?
Yeah, I'm going to say something very briefly on that, because it's Cindy's topic, not my topic, education per se, but the system was designed, the education system was designed to fit the industrial model and to industrialize and commodify humans. And so for me, the recognition that we're leaving that model, the opening up is, what is the model that we want to create, and how do we focus on that? And that has to bring in the elements that for the current, the incumbent system is frankly terrifying. And so there's a part of this there's an imperative to actually do the grassroots, in my opinion, groundswell, sort of like trim tab type of come in quietly, not all guns blazing, which is the old model, and just demonstrate and do it. And do it without the need for bravado or anything else like that, but just do it. And to know that it is always possible for us to actually come together and create something that is for a world with a future.
Yeah, well put.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on the really good point there. Our education system was designed to support the Industrial Revolution, to make the world successful, when the model that we knew was an industrial one, and that even the school hours were designed to get children. As it was transitioning, the parents argued, "Oh no, but we need our kids to be in the field." So then you had the long summer holidays and your hours fitted around the factory working hours. So in a way there's hope in that, because now we need something completely different from our young people if human beings are going to carry on spaceship Earth. You need humans that understand how to design things in syntropy, how to create systems in syntropy. And if we don't start producing those people, whatever it is, whether it's the smartphones of the future, whether it's the clothes we wear, whether it's how we govern planet Earth. There's a fabulous project, I had the privilege to speak on that as well, about global governance of the biosphere. But those are the things that are going to need to emerge, and quickly, for humans to be successful here. And I think that's becoming increasingly apparent. And you are getting shifts in the education system, probably not big enough and not fast enough, but they are starting to happen. What's interesting is it's the young people themselves that are asking for that. They're very, very vocal about saying, we want a different type of education that equips us for the world as it is, not as it was.
Well, I think that's right. And you're taking on, Cindy, the most impressionable, open-hearted time in all of our lives is when we were little kids. And, the Jesuit axiom that give me your child till he's 7 years old and you can have him for the rest of your life is just an indicator of the impressionability of our young people. So, ubiquity takes people mostly 18 years and older. And, that's sort of the second time in a person's life where a person kind of opens to new ideas. But you're taking on, I would say, the foundational first imprint time. And it's, I would love to hear more about your methodology in doing that. And then, Leslie Southwick had a question, said that since you're dealing with kids that age in primary school, et cetera, do you have a number of young children on an advisory board? I mean, how are you developing your relationship and your content strategy in relationship to that particular demographic?
Well, I think that's, thanks for what you've said there, Jim. In a way, it's just such a privilege to work with the young children. They land eco-literate. There's not really that much work to do except to design fabulous things and engage
There's
them.
no unlearning with them.
Yeah,
you don't have
it's
to.
Unlearning. It's so much harder to work with the 18-year-olds or to work with in the boardrooms.
Definitely.
Because the creativity's been squashed out of it. I'm sure we all know the Ken Robinson statistics, where when they're looking for genius and creative geniuses, they find almost 90% of 3-year-olds are. But by the time they've got to, this is NASA actually, by the time they've got to 20 or something, don't quote me on the statistics, but it's down to about 5%. So it's a fabulous age to work with. They're delightful. You just, instead of being part of the shutting down process, you're part of the opening up process. The difficulty is getting the validity of that understood, because people say, oh, no, they have to follow this, they have to be tested on that. And it's fighting the model, fighting the funnel that sends them into the factory, to be the drones. Are we involving children? Yes, we are. We're in very, we're in early stage development, but everything that we do is worked through. We've got a formal set of advisors. We don't have a formal set of child advisory council yet. That would be a brilliant thing to have, but we take everything out and we test it and work with children and ask for their input. And a lot of the activities are inviting children to express themselves, whether it's art or poetry or writing. So hopefully we but there's so much room for collaboration and improvement. So really welcome the ideas that you have for that from this group.
Well, it's such a wonderful experience to hear your enthusiasm with the young people, and I think that you're right that in that age they're like a sponge with great instincts for what's real, and as they move through the system, it's almost bred out of them. And I watched it, with my own son. In fact, one of the fundamental impulses to found Ubiquity University came out of me as a father of 2 sons, and watching how the educational system, particularly with my oldest son, was literally destroying his soul, till he was so beaten down and so alienated from himself. Because kids at that age tend to blame themselves for something going wrong in the family or something going wrong in society. They tend to internalize it till finally he dropped out. And he's actually a brilliant artist and wood turner and extraordinarily masterful. Not until he found his way did his self-esteem begin to come back. So I'd love to have your comment on the relationship between real education and self-esteem.
Well, I think that I might hand this one over to Christine, actually, because there's a fantastic question in the chat which kind of answers that. But if you don't mind me just commenting very quickly, Christine, I think, what would you say are the most important qualities a steward leader should embody? And in some ways, I think they're very similar to what somebody who's educare, lead forth is the root of education, is leading a child forth out of into their life. I think there's a huge crossover. You're looking at so many different domains of worth and value, not just can you pass this test. So that there is a similarity there, Christine. I hope you don't mind me using that as a hybrid to take that question from the chat and hand it back to you, because it is about responsible leadership.
Yeah, well put.
Yeah, so this is to Dr. Ferguson. What would you say the most important qualities of steward leader should embody? What I learned, I can speak from my own experience, that until I needed to become the leader that could become a steward, that could be a steward, versus wanting to control or dominate or co-opt what we were holding. And so there is there's a development to that, which is really critical. And so part of the work that we do in Syntropic Enterprise is that we really acknowledge the source idea, the idea that animates us to act. And the source idea needs to have enough emotion for us to stay acting even when the going gets hard. So not every source idea should be animated, in other words. But each source idea that is being animated, that creates an animation to act, has its own pattern integrity, just like each child that is born has its own pattern integrity. And our role as a steward leader isn't to impose our image or our idea or our something onto that source idea and its pattern integrity. Rather, it is to stay constantly in the question of how do we create the ecology in which that source idea and its pattern integrity are brought more magnificently to life. And so there is a deep listening, a deep respect, a opportunity to stay in communion with the source idea that you are animating and bringing to life. And of course, one of the principles is kind of the principle of principles that we work with in Syntropic is the principle of synergy, which means that we have to start, it's actually a co-opted word largely, but in its pure form, coined by Bucky, interestingly, its origins essentially, is that we start with the universe first. You have to start with the largest perspective, the largest field, the largest consequence that you can hold, because you cannot determine the behavior of the whole by examining the parts separately. And so if we're not deploying synergy, which means if we're not creating ecologies where human minds working together synergistically to create exponential outcomes, if we don't create those ecologies, then we're actually limiting the capacity of and the potentiality of the source idea. And so, that sort of circles back to what I talked about earlier about how do you create the architecture that enables that synergistic response from humans, because there is obviously as well an anti-synergistic response. There is a messy human heap that I referenced. So that's a long answer to your question, but it is a steward leader is a grown-up leader. They're not interested in their own fame and glory. They're actually interested in how to continually stay in dialogue with that which they are holding and bringing to life. So the easiest analogy is an incredible parent or a gardener.
Well, partly that's why I linked the question to children, because you're talking about an idea a source idea that lands, that has a pattern integrity, that the steward leader is responsible for bringing into the world in good shape, true to itself, which is very much links back. You know, when a child lands, as parents or people who know children, they land pretty, you know, with their own pattern integrity. And if you try to squash them out of shape, Jim, as you're talking about with your son, that's when you get this horrible damage. And our education system is designed to fit you into something, because that was the purpose, that you knew you needed this many engineers and this many people to work in the factories, so that the funnel is that. And it still is, you know, it's certainly improved, but that's still in the you know, in the DNA of our education, rather than saying, how do we create a really useful human being who's going to be able to work towards solving the major crisis that we have on Earth in the time that we've got left to do it. And even though everybody might not be born to be this amazing change maker, but even teach them how to live here with in a regenerative way is so important. And surely in that they will find something that is true to themselves, and that where they can make a good contribution, a valued contribution.
There's a question that just came in for you, Christine, from Robert Lockhart on examples of syntropic enterprises. If you had to point to some institutions, companies around the world that exemplify what you're talking about, do any exist?
Yeah, well, that is the really good question. Obviously, you're watching one emerge, which is Planetary, which is fantastic. We have some smaller companies that are part of the syntropic community. The evident one that is the closest demonstration is Patagonia, and part of the reason that I would put them there is that they have demonstrated a commitment over 40 years that has been unwavering, and that's part of understanding the pattern integrity of the source idea, is because when you are trying to bring that to life in current system, the temptation to violate that pattern integrity is fierce and huge, and is at every moment and every turn. And Patagonia have done a really fabulous job against all of those influences, and including knowing completely that they're not perfect, but the journey is ongoing. And so, but sadly, at this point, to be able to show a larger company that people will have familiarity with is pretty hard.
Yeah. I mean, there's a similarity in that sense between what you're doing, Cindy, and an educational system that is completely dysfunctional, and what you're trying to do, Christine. And, you know, we're hard put after now 25, 30 years of corporate social responsibility to point to more than just a handful of companies that are really walking their talk in I would say, a significantly potent way. And it just gives you a measure of how deeply immersed we are in the crisis, and how far we have to go to really solve the problem. And since we're running toward the end of the time, I would like to just ask each of you to make a final statement, given this, the truth of what you're saying, what Planetary and Syntropy Enterprises are doing, against the background of the intractability of the system that is proving itself so intractable. It is literally willing to go down like the Titanic rather than change. And yet change is beginning to happen, but by all accounts, it's not happening fast enough. So as you two look at the world situation, you look at what needs to be done. What would be the priorities that you would put out there as to what's essential for us to understand about taking the next step in developing syntropic enterprises and developing syntropic education, let's say.
Cindy, you want to go first?
It's quite hard to soundbite that, Jim. I mean, I opened with a reading from John O'Donoghue about crossing the threshold. I just think it's taking that decision in your person, I love that line. It's, you work towards a real frontier that cannot be crossed without the heart being passionately engaged and woken up. And if you're feeling that in your heart, then have the courage and step across. And don't worry about the people that are behind you. If enough across, we'll get there. And you just have to have the courage and take that step. Even if it's a small thing in your life that you can do, just do it.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And I was actually going to reference that. So the opening, of course, we're here for a purpose. And each of us has intrinsic value that is essential to the unfolding purpose of this story of universe. And so number one is never forget that. Number two is to be really, really sure that the path that you're choosing is in service to a world with a future, because one of the greatest dangers that we all have is that aspect of ourselves that wants to be superior or dominate, or rather than partner with and be nature and dance with nature, which means we need to start listening to the wind and attending to the call of the places inside us that want to come alive, and know that there are enough people, I truly believe, and even the conversations I've had, done a lot of work in the corporate world, and amazingly good people. This is good people that are caught in a bind that the escape velocity required is so huge and terrifying. And so this is not about bad people necessarily. It's about knowing that we can actually do this and we can be the change, and that it sort of circles back, to the final piece of Cindy's opening, which is this hope. But hope isn't passive. Hope is active. And so it is taking that step, taking the first step, referencing David White, actually, taking the first step without even knowing what the second step is, but trusting that if you are doing it in service to the future of Earth and all her creatures, that the second step will reveal itself. And then particularly when you do that with others, and deploy synergy, the synergistic mind, there's nothing we cannot solve. And it doesn't require big, because nature works in small, unseen actions that can be the trim tab for change.
And we just have a couple minutes left. Cindy, if people want to support
I'm seeing in the chat that
planetary,
people are asking for the reference or a link to the reading that we gave. I'm very sorry, I'm not fast enough on the draw to do that. Somebody's already put it in the chat, but just to let you know, it's from John O'Donoghue's book, Benedictus, which has a different title in America. That in the United States title is called Bless This Space Between Us. So if you're able to find, I'm sure if you Google it, the poem will come up, but somebody has very kindly put it in the link a bit further earlier on in the chat. And thanks to whoever did that. Thanks very much.
and then Cindy, there's a number of people that have been saying on both your accounts, how can we help? How do we get involved? So first you, Cindy, and then you, Christine, how can people get involved with Planetary? How can people get involved with Syntropy Enterprises? How can they support you?
Christine, do you want to?
Oh, yeah. So the first thing is the website is syntropic.world. And you know, we're aiming for a syntropic world, and there's a lot of different ways, because this is about access and about engagement. So there's a lot of different ways that people can access. And so if you go there, and if anyone has any direct questions, there's contact forms there as well. So ask away. And that we have regular open forums. On the next one, we have Daniel Kristen Weil, who I know Jim knows, and we always showcase one of our alumni's enterprises at the same time. So there's lots of different ways. It's very easy for people. I write a daily blog 365 days of the year. It's short, but so there's lots of different ways that people can engage. It's syntropic.world.
Good, thank you. Cindy?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to everybody for for listening to this, and thank you enormously for the offers of help. We're at an early stage. We do have materials that are available that are going into different schools. Oddly enough, we're almost not marketing anything, because we're working out how to do it really well first. We're building things with people who are, who want these things for their communities. But what is really helpful is to build an awareness that teachers, that parents actually want this stuff, because in some ways when we're asking the bigger system to move there, they're looking for the proof that this stuff is needed, that an education in this way is needed. And that's part of a lot of the market research that's being done, is do people actually want or need this? So if you really feel that, if you've got something that you think you again, the Planetary website is www.planetary.world, and there's a contact form there, and I did put my email on the presentation, but it would come through to me. So if there's a way that you think you would like to be part of it, please get in touch. And if there's if you've got just something to say in support of why this kind of education is important, please do send those messages, because that's what we're collecting now, is just a body of, it seems mad when you've got millions of children, students and parents marching in the streets saying that's what they want, but there needs to be a body of evidence to say that that parents and educators want this, so that we can move it forward in a really substantial way. So it would be fabulous to get that feedback from you, to say that you think this is valid.
Well, thank you both so much, and everyone, particularly those of you who are regulars over the 107 days. The beauty of Humanity Rising is that we keep going, so we can deepen the dialogue on these issues like syntropy and education that are deeply complex. And in this case, deeply impacted by the strictures of the past, needing radical reform in a short period of time, under adverse circumstances, as we are all painfully aware, given the pandemic. And so I think what Christine and Cindy represent are courage, simply the courage to be. Christine, the one line that you had in one of your statements is, that leadership comes out of ideas that animate us to act. It's clear that both of you have been animated to act. This passion, as Andrew Harvey says, what wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and won't let go? That's the pathway of a heart. And I think that's what I want to tease out in conclusion, everyone, is two extraordinary leaders, passionate creators that are walking their talk and doing work for the benefit of the whole, at a moment when all of us are being called into account. And I think the final point I would make is, I think the pandemic is revealing that there's no more neutral ground. There's no place on earth that hasn't been impacted all of us are involved now in a single conversation around how we create a world that is worthy of our children unto the 7th generation. And so for the inspiration that you've provided, Cindy and Christine, I'm deeply grateful. You can see from the chats, everybody are dazzled by what you've had to say. And for those of you who want to stay on after the chat, after the session, we have an after session chat group that's just spontaneously emerged and with its own leadership. So if Stan or somebody wants to put the link into the after session, the after party, please do. And if Cindy and Christine can join for even a few minutes, that would be wonderful. So thank you both so much. And maybe down the road in the new year, we can have you back for an update, because education is the revolution and syntropy is the pathway.
Yeah.
So you ladies called it today. Thank you so much. And then on Monday, we're taking the weekend off. And then on Monday, we're having another unbelievable woman leader, Yanling Duan from China, who lives now in Davos and is the founder of Davos Blockchain. And she's a woman who was animated by the idea of getting the World Economic Forum to go sustainable. In some ways, she's in the heart of the beast. And she's done a remarkable job. So she's convened an extraordinary group for our Monday session on the issues of the sacredness of the earth and deep architecture for humanity as we move into beyond the threshold into a new world. So thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you again, same time, 5 p.m. Central European time on Monday for our next week of Humanity Rising. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.